Record. Okay. Well, very good. It's wonderful to see you again with the marvel of this technology that has developed, especially this year. I mean, I was there in Bishkek 2 years ago, uh, closing on 3 years ago. And so I'm happy that we can get together, a time of some political turmoil in both countries, the Kyrgyz Republic and the United States Republic.
No,
So, and that's we haven't had any violence in the streets, but if Trump gets some court rulings in his favor, that may happen. There's still, at least from his corner, um, uh, cries of fraud and discrepancies by election officials in certain key states. So that's a drama that is not yet resolved in the US. So we'll see how that plays out. We
yeah,
like to have our legal technicalities played out in this country to the reward of the attorneys, I might say,
yeah.
in so many aspects of our country and economy. So, in any event, I'm very happy to see you again, Medet, professor, lecturer at the university there in Bishkek. And I again recall my visit there. You were kind enough to arrange a class of students to listen to my commentary, and I appreciated that. There were a couple of them that I continued to be in touch with, believe it or not, via Facebook. So I am happy about that. So, and with regard to that, I was offering to do another lecture a number of weeks ago on the US presidential campaign, and that was not a convenient time for important reasons in the country, which I had been unaware of. So, well, if you would briefly, if you wouldn't mind giving some highlights of the recent turmoil there, which I think stemmed from results of the October 4th parliamentary election. So what was the reason for the upsetment?
Okay, good. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, thanks for last year's lecture at my university, the American University of Central Asia, and it's a good opportunity to catch up with you, indeed, on times when both in the US and in my country as well. We're having
And
something
if you may speak up a little bit.
election-related upheavals. And as you noted, yes, on October 4th, we held scheduled parliamentary elections. And somehow all of it, just to cut the story short, ended up in a, to some extent, forceful resignation of a president. And basically, it's the third time in the short, relatively post-Soviet history of a country when presidents had forcefully resigned, and two of them had even to flee from the country.
If I may ask, what is the term of the president of the Kyrgyz Republic, and when was this president elected?
According to the current constitution, presidents serve one term for 6 years. And the one who just resigned recently after this all, in the midst of all of these events, he was elected in 2017, just 3 years ago.
Right.
So basically,
and as you were saying, I think he had threatened a few days after the riots, if you will, the popular uprising, he threatened to resign, but before doing so, I think he had named a prime minister.
Yes, he was in the middle of the process of parliament getting and appointing a more legitimate prime minister, but then At some point, he decided to resign, although he was making assurances that he would leave, but leave after all these elections, new elections will take place and so forth, when things will be in order and calm and stabilized, but somehow things turned otherwise quickly and rapidly, and then he had to resign.
Right.
So basically, this, yes,
Go ahead.
October 4th started with the next day with a protest over stolen elections. And basically, that's, of course, in the US now, it's not a slogan, but somehow disputes over elections is more familiar in my country, because the events of 2005 were to some extent similar in terms of what triggered protests. It's a claim of elections being stolen. So mismanagement of elections and the way how some electoral actors were participating in elections that led to what we've seen this year. Because eventually on October 5th, the next day after elections, the Central Election Committee was counting votes, and actually it ended up it's three or barely four parties made it up and made it to the parliament, to the dissatisfaction of many. And these three parties were viewed as the ones who were using and abusing these two things, which we have quite often in our elections, is use of administrative resources. It's using state resources for the sake of winning of some parties. And then they've been engaged extensively in the vote buying practices. And somehow all that enraged others. And protests on the October 5th, then in the next night, turned violent when police started to crash and try to disband protesters. And that ended up in a takeover of the governmental building and in another sort of a revolution, if we can put it in that way. So this turmoil was going on, and it's still going on to some extent. It went up to the point that, well, now the government at that time was weak, and the protesters, led by some opposition figures and by parties who were participating in elections, they were fragile and they couldn't consolidate, but they been mostly and largely predominantly tried to do everything within the law, meaning that they have to appeal to sitting parliament, despite the fact they didn't like it, because most of the MPs in the sitting parliament were from the three parties, which were actually the cause of this discontent.
Yeah.
And
So if I may ask, did the parliament that was presumably elected on October the 4th, were those members immediately installed as a government?
no, because the whole point of this protest and somehow the takeover of the governmental building led to this chain of events, which actually in few days after made the Central Election Committee to annul the results.
Right, I read that they had annulled the results of the election. So it was the incumbent existing parliament that did accept or elect the prime minister that had, was it Japarov?
Yes, actually, along that, while disputing the results of elections, there was a struggle for the position of a prime minister, because at that time, prime minister, he and his cabinet resigned, and it was a key aspect of who would be prime minister. And the expectation at that time was it should be more or less a technical person, a caretaker for the situation, until new elections will be held, and etc. But somehow it turned out to be quite political in the sense that, as I mentioned, a fragmented opposition couldn't agree whom to appoint. Then they have to put it through the parliament, with which they didn't have a good relations. And the parliament was also frightened, and it was even difficult to get them to sit together. And partially it's because the building was devastated, the parliament where it should sit.
Right.
But it was more like a fear of MPs for whatever reasons they be feared. So it was very difficult to get them together.
So what was the vote in the parliament? Was that a pretty heavy majority or close to unanimous of the incumbent members of the parliament? And of course, the Kyrgyz Republic has only one chamber. So That can make things easier.
You mean vote for prime minister?
Yeah, the vote for prime minister. What do you think? What was that?
It was a bit difficult, yes, because Japarov, as he was sitting in prison before all this started, and he was released from a prison on this night of protests. And so just within 1 or 2 days, he emerged as a candidate for this position because of the various support he got, and he had the most formidable and organized support behind him. And Parliament tried to elect him, but they didn't have a quorum because in the first meeting, it was then counted that they didn't have enough MPs who voted. So basically, Japarov was appointed as a prime minister from, I think, from the third attempt.
Ah,
The main reason was to get a quorum. And that was also the third time when there was a meeting of him and President Jane-Bekov. That Jane-Bekov, after the second time, Parliament sent a decision about the prime minister to president, and according to the constitution, the president should sign it or reject it, and the president rejected with a note that there should be a quorum and everything should be within the legal process. And then from a third attempt, the parliament was able to put a quorum, and Japarov actually became a prime minister. But within a
right.
few days after, as we talked just a bit earlier, president resigned. And it was quite unexpected in the sense that he said that he would resign in the midst of all these protests. He took a blame and responsibility on himself, but he said that he would oversee the process of new election to the parliament, and when everything will be in place, a new parliament, a new cabinet appointed by the new parliament, then he will step down. But somehow in one day, it quickly turned around. And then the president, he resigned. And Japarov, in being prime minister, he added a title of acting president. And it's another story because according to constitution, the next in line should be speaker of the parliament.
Uh-huh.
Besides the battleground for the position of prime minister, another battleground was for the position of a speaker.
Yes.
So while Japarov was to be appointed as prime minister, his protesters, and he had one of the most organized protesting crowds on the streets, which to some extent were shaping the attitudes among the political elite.
So how is that resolved as to who is the acting or interim president? Who has that position? Is it the speaker of the parliament or the prime minister?
The speaker should be. And how it happened, it's after this October 5th protests, the speaker resigned. And they elected another speaker, who then immediately after Jane-Bekov resigned said that he is incapable of taking over a position of a president, that he cannot be an acting president, which then somehow led to the situation that it should have passed to the next in line, which is a prime minister, which is Japarov. So that's how he
I
came
see.
to having two titles.
Right. So the second speaker couldn't fulfill the responsibilities of acting president, but the Constitution provided that the prime minister would then become the acting president.
Yeah, the next in line is the prime minister, yes.
Wow. Well, that's very, very interesting sequence of events. And we have some of those same kinds of short circuits, if you want to call them that, or provisions in the US Constitution. There were some scenarios that were suggested that could occur if no one in the US got a majority of the Electoral College, which is a whole separate subject for us, often misunderstood. But if no one got a majority of the 538 electors, then that would go to the House of Representatives in the US, voting by state. And there are 50 states, as you probably know. and whoever controls the delegation for that state determines where that state's vote goes. And at least before this election, a majority of the states were controlled by Republicans. So if it ever got to that stage, the states voting could select Trump as president, despite everything else. They could still do that. But then there was another scenario which said that if no one came out of that vote, it would then go to the Speaker of the House in the United States. It would default to that person. So it's fortunate that these constitutions have some triggers and short circuits.
Yeah, it's good.
So at this point, the Central Election Commission, which invalidated the October 4th election, who schedules and when is scheduled to have new parliamentary elections? When is that going to happen?
Well, that was another phase of this whole story, that after annulling that result of these elections, the Central Election Committee was looking at what is prescribed by the law, and actually they announced and set a date for the parliamentary elections, which is December 20th.
Really?
Yes.
Next month, then, December 20th. Yes, and did the commission do that?
Yes, the commission has the right to do that, and somehow it's written in the electoral laws that it should even happen by default, that you don't even need to signature of a president to announce it, and etc. It's just certain technicalities, but somehow it should be just a schedule. If it's regular schedule, it's usually put there. If it's something unexpected happens, then it's usually stipulations.
Well, this is a lot of drama, actually. Now, when someone succeeds to the office of president, do they fulfill that term? Like our vice president, if they succeed, and it has happened, they complete the term. So the 6-year term.
Not in our case, because if president resigns, it means there should be new elections immediately announced. After
and
that.
who announces that? The commission?
Yes, the commission, but you see the story with the presidential elections, it's a bit complicated. I said that the parliamentary elections were scheduled by the Central Election Commission, but then the parliament gathered and they postponed elections. And that's where the story became even more dubious in the sense of its legality and legitimacy. Because the parliament, according to the law, should serve only 5 years. And on October 28th, these people, 120 MPs, should have stepped down.
Right. Yes, because their term ended, should have ended on 10/28, but then when you have there was no new parliament elected because it was invalidated. So what's the, who was to determine?
Some expectations were, well, they can still be the parliament, but the new election should take place as soon as possible, as prescribed by the law. But what they did is they suspended some of the clauses of the electoral law to some extent indefinitely, with stipulations that we need to have constitutional reform. And it doesn't make sense to elect new parliament unless we'll define what is the role of this parliament. And all of that was driven by Japarov, who was saying that, well, people demand change of constitution, that the whole thing and troubles we have, it's because of the way how our political system is structured. And that's why there was this announcement of the possible constitutional reform and postponement of parliamentary elections. So this date, December 20th, is not valid anymore. And we don't have a clear date now for the parliamentary elections. What we do have now is the announcement of the presidential elections, which are now set for January 10th. this is something which is already in place. Central Election Committee started the process, and now we have, I think, more than 60 candidates which announced that they would start
So how
electoral
many
race.
candidates did you say?
More than 60.
60. Wow.
Yes, 60. But of
So-
course, once they will gather needed 30,000 signatures, once they will put some money to deposit and etc., this number will dwindle significantly.
Right. Wow. So do you think that when will the new parliamentary elections be set? Is that unknown? And that it would possibly be after the presidential election?
Yeah, that's what is actually still ongoing. Just yesterday, the parliament announced a new draft law about the referendum for the change of constitution, which
Yes.
seemingly they aim to combine with the presidential elections, to have referendum on January 10th again,
Right.
as well, along with the presidential elections.
Yeah. Now, did you say
And of
the
course-
the members of parliament are in for 5-year terms? Is that right?
Yes, it's a 5-year term.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Wow. Well, you know, sometimes people think that the U.S. system is very clean and tidy, which it isn't. And in the early years of our republic, like the Kyrgyz Republic, while we didn't have popular uprising, there were very a lot of problems with presidential elections and who was going to, how they could be voted. And, you know, the country became independent in 1776, had a weak constitution until 1789, no, 1787, and the first presidential election in 1788. And then the first contested election in 1796, there was a problem with that election. And there was a problem again in 1800, 4 years later. And another amendment to our Constitution was done in 1804 to solve some of these problems. So in the early days of any republic,
It's exactly 30 years, right, from the start.
that's a
Yes,
good
we have
point.
no
I didn't realize that exactly. 30 years, like in your case, almost 30 years, that these things have to be ironed out. The mechanics of elections have to be ironed out. And the US, you know, still grappling with this. I mean, we had presidents in the year 2000, then in 2016, who got more votes, popular votes, but they were still elected president because of this electoral college. And I think people were ready for some different, for different scenarios even this year, which haven't happened yet. So, well, this is going to be very suspenseful. Well, let me ask you this question also. Sometimes there are international organizations that are asked in by a country to supervise elections, or maybe not supervise, but to observe. Is any of that in the offing for your republic, that any other organization would come in that would look at these at the proceedings? Is that so?
Yeah,
Any international organization?
It's a regular practice for most of this post-Soviet times. It is for the last 20 years, I would say, that it's international observers, electoral observers are coming, and they're coming from OSCE and also from the CIS and the SCO. CIS is the Commonwealth of Independent
Right.
States, former Soviet republics, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They also sent the observers.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, do you think that they have a unified command or a unified organization to do this?
Uh,
In other words, I mean, you mentioned different
okay, unified.
organizations observe, but in doing so, would they act together in some way to,
No, I think they are doing that independent from each other because
uh,
they sent by different organizations, and I don't know the details of the selecting those who are part of this observation teams and etc. But they're doing separate.
right? Yeah, right, I can see that. Well, that's quite interesting, and maybe that will be a solution in some respect if they can unify their efforts so
I
that
think it will be difficult because sometimes it happens to be, as I know many observe, CIS and an SCO, usually electoral observers, they just rubber stamp whatever the electoral authorities of post-Soviet countries say the results are, whereas OECE observers tend to be more critical because seemingly they've at least we have two camps, OECE, and on the other side it's the CIS and SCO. Different standards in regard to what is considered to be decent election and to what extent it was fair, competitive, and so forth and so forth. So in that
that's
sense, for them, it
correct.
will be difficult to unify. I can imagine that SCO and CIS commissions, observer teams can be unified in that sense.
Right. Well, that would be um, a diplomatic stroke of some type if someone can unify these efforts um, to be a good observer of the. So I think that the country is probably maybe a third urban population, if that's a good estimate, and others are in the countryside.
Yeah, more than a half at least. I don't remember the exact figures. More than a half people live in rural areas, and
Right,
percent of those who live in rural areas are quite close to those who engage in agriculture.
right, right. Well, apart from the allegations of fraud and self-dealing, et cetera, if you want to call it corruption, of these certain leading families or political groups, elites, what are the underlying tensions in the country that give rise to these centers of power, people that want to control things? Is it something to do with nationality or ethnic um, affiliation, or is it strictly politics?
Well, I think it's a mix of many things. It's when it comes to interethnic relations, there is a participation of various ethnic groups, but of course the Kyrgyz as a major in terms of size and dominant ethnic group, they dominate the politics. If you look at the composition of the parliament, the government, and there is other state entities, it's a domination mostly of one ethnic group. So in that sense, and it becomes even further divided within the Kyrgyz ethnic group. There is regional divisions. For a long time, it quite often was sometimes overstated, but still was present. This divide, so-called north-south, that is it elite from which region who comes to power. And that's why at some point when this proportional representation electoral system was introduced, meaning that it was not majoritarian voting district, but rather you should run to elections by party lists. There was a stipulation that any party should not only pass the national threshold, but also should pass the regional threshold.
Oh,
By this, there was an attempt to not to create regional parties, but parties should have bases in each of the region. So that was one of the indications that there was a certain issues related to this
right.
regional divide.
So where we are today in terms of the parliament, does that mean that a party has to get, what's the threshold for representation in parliament in the
For
popular vote?
For the last elections which were annulled, it was 7%. 7%. And actually, many people, including myself, speculate that it was basically the only barrier which could have prevented, if it would be removed, would have prevented all these events. Let's say if it would be 5%, most of the protesting parties would have ended up in the parliament, and there would be no enough strength to protest results of elections. So
Right.
somehow there was a stupid
Oh,
mistake on behalf of the sitting parliament, ex-president. They should
well,
have
that's
lowered.
a very interesting analysis. So if you get over 7%, any of the parties that do, then they share proportionately in the parliament, of which how many members of parliament are there?
120.
120.
Yes.
So what happened on October 4th was that four parties exceeded 7%, and they were to share on their percentage in the number of seats of the 120.
Yeah, and that was often discussed that its increase of the threshold is destabilizing factor. And partially it's because also it's a lot of wasted votes, because number of voters who voted for parties who didn't reach the threshold, their votes are wasted in vain. And in that sense, the bigger
Uh,
that proportion of wasted votes, the more of a proportion of unhappy population we have.
well, let me ask you a tough question, but you seem to know all these analytics very well. Um, what was the percentage of popular vote of all those parties that got less than 7%? I mean, that could be, it could be 30 or 40% of the popular vote was parties who had less than 7%, the
Yeah,
total of their votes.
don't I don't remember exactly the figure, but I think it was even more than 40%. It was
Really?
close, yeah. So in that sense, it's not only unhappiness of elite, which can then lead and mobilize for protest, but it's also it's not effective.
Yeah.
Not
So, I mean, there
because it.
were, from what I've read and heard and what you've said, there were issues about the validity or the of the vote, the fraud, et cetera, but also the mechanics of it kind of biased to the larger parties.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah,
a lot of people, here in the U.S. again to draw that comparison, we only have two parties, really, and so how happy can we be? A lot of people are not happy with that, and occasionally you have these other parties that pop up, maybe do okay in a given election, but they don't get anywhere. They have a hard time qualifying for the national ballot. In 1992, if then President Bush had gotten the votes of Ross Perot, he would have beaten Bill Clinton. And I think that the case could be made that the Perot voters, although many of them were new voters, the Perot voters might have been Bush votes in the end.
mm,
But he was denied the presidency because of Perot got 18% of the vote. But of course, it also goes to each state in our case. And there were some states there were some places in 2016 where the Green Party candidate could have been accused of taking Hillary Clinton votes in a couple of states anyway. She was if her votes had gone to Clinton, Clinton would have taken the state and Trump wouldn't have been elected. So these democracies have their intricacies and
yeah,
problems with
yeah.
things, but
Nothing is perfect.
we're stuck with only two parties, but we don't have a parliamentary system really. So, and of course, I think apart from the politics, the country has been, like many countries, suffered from the pandemic. Is that not true? Its economy.
Yes, true. Yes, indeed. The pandemics hit Kyrgyzstan quite heavily, and there were two waves of this epidemics this year. And partially it's also added to the electoral campaign as well, because the mismanagement by the government of the epidemics was also one of the reasons sometimes which was
That
shaping the electoral
right,
campaign.
exactly. And I think, that was part of why Trump lost. He disaffected certain constituencies. They referred to suburban women as
Mhm.
one. But basically, the pandemic did him in. I mean, you go back to January and February of this year, most people thought that he was going to be reelected.
Mhm.
And then he was fell victim to so-called mismanagement of the pandemic, which
Mm.
anyone could have been accused, but there are many elements to that. So the uh, the economy is suffering there. And what about the American University of Central Asia, ALCA?
Mhm.
Is that continuing, and are classes given remotely, or how is that handled? How is the teaching
Yeah.
done?
Yeah, actually, we started to go. We went online already in the previous semester since April after the spring break, and this semester is fully online as well. And there are no clear plans yet for the next semester, but quite likely it may be online as well.
Oh, mm,
So somehow it becomes a bit of a normality.
right. Well, have you been
Yeah,
able to keep up the enrollment, although it is online?
yeah. Somehow, despite some expectations, this year's enrollment were quite good, even slightly better than last year.
Well, that's
Although
good.
maybe partially it was because of the lockdowns, inability to travel. Many young people who wanted maybe to go abroad, they were decided to study at home. So it's one
All
of the
right.
explanations
Well,
why we didn't have drops.
yeah. Well, it's a wonderful facility. And again, I really felt privileged to be able to come by and spend a couple of hours there and see that campus, which was so striking in the building and its site. And I could see why, among the disciplines offered, why students would want to have their education there.
Yeah, yeah. Also, or we're missing like our campus as well. I
Right.
haven't seen it
Well,
for a
it's
long time.
certainly, well, do you find yourself and any of the other professors having one on one? I mean, in addition to teaching classes, are you able also to have some one on one meetings with students or
Yes,
tutoring,
yes.
if you will?
Basically, to some extent, we somehow maybe replicating what we usually when we had it offline at campus, when we had office hours, meetings, and so forth. Now we're just doing it online through Zoom. Sometimes the students need to meet and talk. We organize it.
Right, office hours. All right. Well, it's been a tremendous challenge for everybody to have this terrible pandemic on us.
Uh,
Um, well, turning just as we wind up here to a even more broad or geopolitical perspective, certainly China seems to have been a country wanting more influence in Central Asia and providing infrastructure, if
mhm.
you will. Anything you can comment about how that has proceeded with the um, the initiative, the Belt and Road BRI initiative?
Mhm. Yeah, it goes it went some few years ago steadily, and when you look at country like Kyrgyzstan and other countries like Kyrgyzstan, it was mostly interest of Chinese investment in the mining sector, in some other oil refineries, for example, as we have in Kyrgyzstan. So these infrastructural projects. And Kyrgyzstan, as for example, neighboring Tajikistan, they've been quite heavily dependent on Chinese loans, which were provided by the Chinese governmental banks. And by now 40% of external debt of Kyrgyzstan is owed to China. And actually next year starts a bit of a difficult period when we have to repay some of the loans which we took, whatever, 6, 8 years ago. And it will be, besides dealing with pandemics and consequences of pandemics,
Yeah.
it's an issue of repaying the debt. That will be a problem.
It's a very difficult problem for the Treasury. Now, is this debt, probably as far as China goes, is it with Chinese banks and maybe companies as well? And is it denominated in yuan?
I don't know in terms of to which currency it's attached, but yes, it goes through this Import-Export Bank of China.
Ah,
And I don't know which actual currency.
right. Well, that's
Yeah,
right. What about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB? Is that been active in lending at all? You know, that was developed by the Chinese.
Yeah, I don't know actually, because
Right.
I'm not deeply into that subject.
Yeah, I don't know
Not
to
sure,
what
but
extent they
yeah,
have used that, what their loans outstanding have been.
mhm.
Anything you'd care to comment about the role of the U.S. in the Kyrgyz Republic? Are there any kinds of direct investments or loans
Oh,
that?
there are not so much of direct investments, because in terms of investment and trade, US and Kyrgyzstan are quite far apart from each other. In that sense, at least I don't observe, and I haven't heard that it's significant.
Right.
US is involved in the provision of aid and in various sectors: democratization, economics, agriculture, and etc., etc. So in that sense, among bilateral donors, it's quite significant. And well, I think it was, as you may know, prominent on the map because of the post 9/11 engagement of the US in Afghanistan, and the whole Central Asia was important as an adjacent region.
But then
Now,
the U.S. base, that lease was terminated or not renewed. Maybe terminated is a better uh, terminology. Recalling, was that 2005 when that was done?
you mean the
The U.S. base.
US military base? No, yeah, it's actually came in almost immediately after 9/11, and then it was terminated during Atambayev's presidency. It was, I think, 2014, if I'm.
Oh, 2014.
So it's
I
not
couldn't
so
remember
long
the
ago.
date. Right. So, well, I guess I would offer to you, as we initially got back in contact, I was saying, hey, I'd be happy to talk about the U.S. presidential election. There are other technical issues which still to be resolved, but I did want to say to you, I'd be very happy of anything you would arrange, of course, at no cost to anybody, to give some commentary on the U.S. in any way that you think would be informative for your students. So I leave that offer with you, and happy to do that at any time.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think it could be useful, yeah,
Right.
in the near future, maybe in
Well,
some
thank you very
course or
much.
maybe lecture.
It's been enjoyable and engaging to be back in touch with you again.
For me as well.
Yes, and to have your insights on things in the Kyrgyz Republic. And I hope that things go smoothly and dates get set and fulfilled. So I'll probably want to check back with you to see how things are going, either as of the January date or just afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Bill. It was good seeing you, and hope everything will go up after elections in the US as well.
Very good.
We need smoothening our post-electoral processes. Yeah.
That's what we should do. We should reconvene on reporting to each other how this all ended up.
Yeah,
Very
looking
good.
forward to happy endings.
Very good. Thank you so much. We'll
Thank you, Bill.
bye-bye.